He was just a humble single father from a forgotten corner of Brooklyn, working out of a cramped garage with grease-stained hands and more determination than dollars. The Millionaire CEO was everything he wasn't: polished, arrogant, and convinced. That real innovation only came from glass towers and seven-figure budgets. When Rogers Gus dared to show his revolutionary engine modification at the annual Metro Tech Expo, Peregrine Thorne laughed him off the stage, dismissing him as just another backyard tinkerer playing with scrap metal. No one expected what happened next. Not the stunned audience, not Rogers himself, not even the CEO who just humiliated him. But sometimes it's the grease-stained hands working in forgotten corners that create the breakthroughs that change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Eastside Automotive, casting long shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor of what used to be a thriving auto repair shop in Detroit's Corktown district. Rogers Gus knelt beside a 1987 Honda Civic, its hood propped open like a patient on an operating table, revealing an engine that had seen better decades. At 34, Rogers had the kind of weathered hands that told stories calloused from years of wrestling with stubborn bolts, scarred from encounters with sharp metal edges, permanently stained with motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. His flannel shirt, once red and black, had faded to a dusty rose and charcoal, and his jeans bore the patina of 1,000 crawls. Beneath cars that most mechanics would have declared beyond hope. The shop itself reflected its owner's circumstances. What had once been his father's pride and joy, Eastside Automotive, established 1962, now operated on a shoestring budget and sheer determination. The hydraulic lift in Bay 2 had been broken for 8 months, forcing Rogers to rely on jackstands and floor jacks for most jobs. The diagnostic computer was a decade old, held together with electrical tape and prayer. The waiting area still had the same cracked vinyl chairs from 1985, their stuffing visible through tears that Rogers had tried to mend with duct tape. But Rogers Gus possessed something that money couldn't buy and corporate training couldn't teach: an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. While other mechanics relied increasingly on computer diagnostics and expensive equipment, Rogers could listen to an engine's idle and tell you exactly which cylinder was misfiring, whether the timing was off, or if the fuel injectors needed cleaning. It was a gift his father had recognized early, nurtured through countless hours in this very garage, teaching Rogers that engines weren't just machines, they were conversations waiting to happen. Every engine has a voice, his father used to say, wiping his hands on the same red shop rag Rogers still kept in his back pocket. Most people just don't know how to listen. The Honda's owner, Mrs. Chun, a retired schoolteacher who'd been bringing her cars to Eastside for 15 years, had described the problem as making a funny noise and losing power on hills. 3 other shops had quoted her between $800 and $1,200 for a complete engine rebuild. Rogers had listened to the engine for 30 seconds and diagnosed a faulty mass airflow sensor, $40 part, and 20 minutes of labor. As he worked, Rogers's mind wandered to the pile of bills stacked on his cluttered desk in the office. Rent was due in 5 days. His 8-year-old son Finch needed new shoes. The solace of his current pair were held on with Gorilla Glue and hope. The electric company had sent a final notice, and the parts supplier was threatening to cut off credit until the account was current. Rogers had been a single father since Finch was 2, when his wife Linda decided that the uncertainty of small business ownership and the constant smell of motor oil weren't compatible with her vision of suburban respectability. She'd moved to Phoenix with a pharmaceutical sales rep, sending birthday cards twice a year and a modest child support check that barely covered daycare. The garage was more than Rogers's livelihood. It was his legacy, his identity, and increasingly, his burden. Customers were fewer these days. drawn to the gleaming service bays of dealerships and the marketing budgets of national chains. Neighborhood itself was changing, young professionals moving in and preferring to lease new cars with warranty coverage rather than repair older vehicles with character and history. But Rogers refused to give up. Not because he was stubborn, though he was, but because this garage represented something larger than profit margins and efficiency metrics. In a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and automation, Eastside Automotive was a place where human intuition still mattered, where experience trumped expensive equipment, where the relationship between a mechanic and a machine was still understood as a form of craftsmanship. The Honda's engine purred to life as Rogers turned the key, the rough idle smoothing into the steady rhythm of properly balanced combustion. He smiled, the same satisfaction he'd felt thousands of times before flooding through him. It never got old, the moment when a sick engine became healthy again, when the puzzle pieces fell into place, when harmony was restored to the mechanical symphony. Mrs. Chun would be thrilled. The repair would cost her $67 instead of $800. She'd tell her friends, and maybe one or two of them would remember that real expertise didn't always come with marble floors and designer uniforms. Rogers wiped his hands on his father's old shop rag and glanced at the framed photograph on his workbench, Finch grinning gap-toothed in his Little League uniform, holding a wrench almost as big as his arm. The boy had inherited his grandfather's curiosity and his father's ear for engine diagnostics, often spending afternoons after school in the garage, learning to distinguish between the healthy purr of a well-tuned V6 and the labored wheeze of worn valve seals. What Rogers didn't know, as he closed the Honda's hood and prepared to call Mrs. Chun with the good news, was that his quiet mastery of internal combustion engines was about to collide with a world of corporate boardrooms, million-dollar egos, and automotive innovation on a scale he'd never imagined. In less than 48 hours, his name would be known to engineers at Ferrari, Lamborghini, and McLaren, not as a small-time mechanic from Detroit's East Side, but as the man who'd solved a problem that had stumped some of the most brilliant automotive minds in the world. The revolution would begin not with fanfare or recognition, but with a single phone call from a desperate customer, asking if Rogers could take a look at something unusual, a prototype engine that had been declared unfixable by every expert who'd examined it. The afternoon crowd at Mickey's Diner consisted of the usual suspects: construction workers grabbing late lunch, retired auto workers nursing coffee that had been sitting too long, and Rogers Gus, who occupied the same corner booth every Tuesday and Thursday while Finch attended after-school tutoring at Jefferson Elementary. Rogers spread the morning's invoices across the scarred Formica table, a calculator that had seen better decades beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The numbers told the same story they'd been telling for months. Eastside Automotive was surviving, but barely. $347 in parts costs, $260 in labor charges, minus rent, utilities, insurance, and the endless parade of small expenses that kept a garage operational. "You look like a man trying to squeeze blood from a stone," said Mabel Hill, sliding into the booth opposite him. Mabel ran Hill's Hardware 3 blocks down from the garage, and had been watching Rogers's father struggle through recessions and boom times for 20 years before Rogers inherited both the business and its challenges. "More like trying to stretch." $1 until it screams," Rogers replied, not looking up from his calculations. "Mrs. Patterson's transmission is going to need a complete rebuild, but she's on a fixed income. I can't charge her what the job's actually worth." Mabel stirred sugar into her coffee with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed the same ritual thousands of times. She was 63, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from watching neighborhoods change, businesses rise and fall, and people adapt or disappear. "Your father had the same problem," she said. "Too soft-hearted for his own good." But the neighborhood remembered that kindness when times got tough. Rogers finally looked up. The neighborhood's changing, Mabel. Half these young professionals buy cars with warranties that last longer than my tools. They don't need a mechanic, they need a service appointment scheduled through an app. Through the diner's window, Rogers could see his 10-year-old Ford pickup parked next to a Tesla Model S and a BMW X5. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on him. Detroit was experiencing a renaissance, but it was a selective renewal that didn't necessarily include family-owned auto shops that still advertised with hand-painted signs and business cards printed at the local Kinko's. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Finch bounded in with the kinetic energy that only 8-year-old boys could sustain. His backpack was almost as big as he was, stuffed with textbooks, a soccer ball, and a collection of small mechanical parts that Rogers had given him to examine: springs, gaskets, and worn spark plugs that told stories of combustion and compression. "Dad! Dad! Look what I found!" Finch dropped into the booth beside his father and produced a small metal cylinder from his pocket. "Mrs. Stone said it fell out of her car when she brought it to you last week." Rogers examined the object, a fuel injector from a late-model Mercedes. Probably worth more than some of his customers spent on groceries in a month. "That's a fuel injector, buddy. It sprays gas into the engine so the car can run." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "But why is it all gunked up?" Finch asked, running his finger along the clogged nozzle. "Wouldn't that make the car run bad?" "Exactly right," Rogers said, pride warming his voice. "When these get dirty, the engine can't breathe properly. It's like trying to drink a milkshake through a straw that's got peanut butter stuck in it." Mabel watched the interaction with the satisfied expression of someone witnessing a master craftsman passing knowledge to an eager apprentice. "That boy's got your ear for engines," she observed. "Just last week I saw him in the parking lot, listening to old Mr. Torvin's Buick and telling him his timing belt was making noise." Rogers felt a familiar mix of pride and worry. Finch had inherited the family gift for automotive diagnosis, but Rogers wasn't sure he wanted his son to inherit the family business. The automotive repair industry was changing faster than small shops could adapt. Independent mechanics were being squeezed between dealership service departments with factory-trained technicians and quick lube chains that prioritized speed over craftsmanship. "Tell you what," Rogers said to Finch, "help me clean this injector when we get back to the shop, and I'll show you how the ultrasonic cleaner works." Finch's eyes lit up. The ultrasonic cleaner was one of the garage's few pieces of modern equipment, a device that used high-frequency sound waves to remove deposits from fuel system components. Rogers had bought it used from a shop that was closing, and it had quickly become one of his most valuable tools. The walk back to Eastside Automotive took them through 6 blocks of Detroit's Corktown district, past Victorian houses being renovated, into trendy lofts, century-old churches that anchored blocks of modest homes, and empty lots that sprouted wildflowers and the occasional urban garden. It was a neighborhood in transition, holding on to its working-class roots while attracting young professionals, drawn by proximity to downtown and housing prices that were still reasonable by big city standards. The garage occupied a corner lot that Rogers' grandfather had purchased in 1962, back when Detroit's automotive industry was the envy of the world and skilled mechanics could earn middle-class livings, fixing cars that were built to be repaired rather than replaced. The building itself was solid brick and steel construction that had weathered 5 decades of Michigan winters, but it needed paint, new windows, and a roof that didn't leak when the wind blew from the northeast. Inside, the garage retained the character of its origins. Hand tools hung on pegboards in arrangements that made sense only to Rogers, organized by frequency of use rather than size or type. A 1960s-era tire machine occupied one corner, still functional despite its age. The smell was layered and complex motor oil, brake fluid, the metallic tang of steel and iron, And underneath it all, the ghostly scent of his father's cigarettes, which had been banned from the workspace for over a decade. "Can we work on the mystery engine?" Finch asked, dropping his backpack beside Rogers's desk. The mystery engine was a side project Rogers had been tinkering with for months. A mystery engine was a side project Rogers had been tinkering with for months. Small displacement V6 that he'd been modifying with experimental combustion chamber designs and fuel delivery systems. It wasn't connected to any specific vehicle. It was pure research, the kind of mechanical exploration that kept Rogers's mind engaged during slow periods. "After homework," Rogers replied, but he was already walking toward the engine stand where his prototype waited. The modifications he'd made were subtle but significant: altered compression ratios, redesigned intake ports, and a fuel injection timing system that defied conventional wisdom about optimal combustion sequences. Rogers didn't know it yet, but this experimental engine would soon be the center of attention at the Metro Tech Expo, drawing the scrutiny of industry experts, the mockery of corporate executives, and ultimately, the interest of engineers from Maranello, Italy, who'd spent months trying to solve the exact problem Rogers had addressed with nothing more than intuition, experience, and a willingness to listen to what the engine was trying to tell him. The call came on a Friday morning while Rogers was elbow-deep in the engine bay of a 2003 Dodge Ram, fighting with a serpentine belt that had apparently been installed by someone who believed automotive repair was a form of abstract art. The phone's shrill ring echoed through the garage, competing with the classic rock station that provided Rogers's workday soundtrack. "East Side Automotive," he answered, phone cradled between his shoulder and ear while his hands remained buried in the engine compartment. "Is this Rogers, Gus?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of confident authority that usually accompanied expensive suits and corner offices. "Speaking. What can I do for you? My name is Daisy Barnes. I'm the events coordinator for the Metro Tech Expo. I'm calling because your name came up in an interesting conversation yesterday." Rogers straightened, wiping his hands on his shop rag. The Metro Tech Expo was Detroit's premier showcase for automotive innovation, held annually at the convention center downtown. It drew engineers from major manufacturers, startup entrepreneurs with revolutionary ideas, and investors looking for the next breakthrough in transportation technology. It was decidedly not the kind of event that typically included mechanics from neighborhood garages. "I think you might have the wrong Rogers." "Gus," he said, "I run a small repair shop. We fix cars, we don't invent them." Daisy's laugh was warm but determined. "Actually, I think we have exactly the right Rogers, Gus. Dr. Linda Croft from Wayne, State's Mechanical Engineering Department, mentioned you during our planning committee meeting. She said you've been working on some experimental engine modifications. That could be quite revolutionary." Rogers's mind raced. Dr. Croft was Mrs. Chun's daughter, the retired school teacher whose Honda he'd repaired the week before. Linda had stopped by the garage a few months ago when visiting her mother, and had spent an hour examining Rogers's prototype engine with the focused intensity of someone who understood both the theory and practical applications of internal combustion technology. "Dr. Croft may have overstated things," Rogers said carefully. "I've been tinkering with some fuel efficiency improvements, but it's just hobby work. Nothing that would interest serious engineers. Mr. Gus, the automotive industry is at a crossroads. Electric vehicles are gaining market share, but internal combustion engines aren't going away anytime soon. Any innovation that improves efficiency or reduces emissions is potentially worth millions of dollars. Dr. Croft showed me some preliminary data from your modifications, and frankly, we'd be idiots not to give you a platform to present your work." Rogers felt the familiar knot of anxiety that accompanied any situation that pushed him beyond his comfort zone. The garage was his domain, a controlled environment where he understood the rules and possessed clear expertise. The corporate world of automotive innovation was foreign territory, populated by people with advanced degrees, unlimited research budgets, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about whether they could afford next month's rent. "I appreciate the offer," Rogers began, "but I don't think there's a $20,000 prize for the most innovative small-scale engineering breakthrough," Daisy interrupted. "Plus potential licensing opportunities with major manufacturers, Mr. Gus. Some of the biggest names in the industry will be there. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis. Even some European manufacturers are sending representatives. $20,000. Rogers felt his resistance wavering. $20,000 would cover 6 months of rent, fix the broken lift in Bay 2, replace the ancient diagnostic computer, and still leave enough for Finch's college fund. It was more money than Eastside Automotive typically netted in. "Good quarter. What exactly would I need to do?" he asked. "Present your modifications to a panel of industry experts. You'd have 20 minutes to explain your approach, demonstrate the technology, and answer questions. We'd provide space for a static display. You could bring your prototype engine, supporting documentation, whatever you need to tell your story effectively." Rogers looked around the garage at the oil-stained floors, the mismatched tools, the hand-painted sign that had been advertising Eastside Automotive since before he was born. The idea of transporting his experimental engine to the gleaming convention center, of standing before corporate executives and university professors, seemed as foreign as explaining quantum physics to his 8-year-old son. "The deadline for applications was last month," Daisy continued, "but Dr. Croft convinced our committee to extend a special invitation. Your work represents exactly the kind of grassroots innovation the expo was designed to showcase." Through the garage's windows, Rogers could see Finch's school bus approaching. In a few minutes, his son would bound through the door with homework questions, stories from the playground, and the boundless enthusiasm that made even the longest workdays worthwhile. Finch believed his father could fix anything, solve any mechanical puzzle, make any broken engine run like new. What would it mean for the boy to see his father compete on a stage with engineers from major corporations? "I'd need to think about it," Rogers said. "Of course. But I'll need an answer by Monday morning if you're interested. The expo is 3 weeks away, which doesn't give us much time for preparation." After Daisy hung up, Rogers stood in the garage's silence, contemplating the magnitude of what he was considering. The prototype engine sat on its stand in the corner, looking innocent enough, a collection of aluminum and steel components that he'd modified based on intuition, experience, and countless hours of careful experimentation. To him, it was a puzzle solved, a challenge overcome. To the automotive industry, it might represent something much more significant. Finch burst through the door with his typical energy, backpack flying, soccer ball in hand. "Dad, guess what happened at school today?" "What happened, buddy?" "Mrs. Stone's car wouldn't start in the parking lot, and I told her it sounded like her starter motor was going bad, and she said I was probably right because the same thing happened to her neighbor last week." Rogers smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Sounds like you're turning into quite the mechanic." "I want to be as good as you someday," Finch said with the absolute certainty that only 8-year-olds could muster. "Maybe even better." As Rogers helped Finch with homework that afternoon, explaining the physics of simple machines and the mathematics of gear ratios, he found himself thinking about legacy, opportunity, and the difference between playing it safe and taking the kind of risks that could change everything. The Metro Tech Expo represented a doorway to a world Rogers had never seriously considered entering. Beyond that doorway waited corporate executives who would judge his work, competitors with unlimited resources, and the possibility of either vindication or humiliation on a very public stage. What Rogers didn't know was that one of those corporate executives was Peregrine Thorne, CEO of Thorne Dynamics, a man whose combination of wealth, arrogance, and dismissive attitude toward backyard mechanics would soon make him the perfect foil for a story about expertise, respect, and the dangerous tendency to judge innovation by its packaging rather than its substance. By Monday morning, Rogers would make a decision that would set in motion a chain of events leading to his public humiliation, his private vindication, and ultimately to a phone call from Ferrari that would validate everything he'd ever believed about the value of listening to engines. With both his head and his heart, Rogers spent the weekend wrestling with the decision the way he'd once wrestled with a stubborn transmission that refused to cooperate despite hours of careful adjustment. Sunday evening found him in the garage long after Finch had gone to bed, staring at the prototype engine that had somehow become the center of a choice that could reshape their lives. The engine sat on its stand under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking simultaneously promising and inadequate. In the familiar environment of his garage, surrounded by tools that had served 3 generations of Gus mechanics, the modifications seemed brilliant, elegant solutions to complex problems. But Rogers could already imagine how it would look in the gleaming halls of the convention center, next to displays funded by million-dollar research budgets and teams of PhD engineers. Monday morning brought the call to Daisy Barnes, and with it, the point of no return. "I'll do it," Rogers said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I'll present at the expo." "Excellent." Daisy's enthusiasm crackled through the phone. "I'll email you the presentation guidelines and logistics information. You'll be in the innovation showcase, competing against some fascinating projects. There's a startup from Ann Arbor working on solid-state batteries, a team from Michigan Tech with a revolutionary transmission design, and several other breakthrough technologies." After hanging up, Rogers felt the first wave of genuine panic. Competing against university research teams and well-funded startups was like entering a Formula One race driving his 10-year-old pickup truck. These people had resources, credentials, marketing departments, and presentation skills honed in boardrooms and lecture halls. The first obstacle materialized immediately: transportation. The prototype engine weighed nearly 400 pounds, mounted on a steel test stand that Rogers had welded himself. His pickup truck could handle the weight, but the engine would need to be secured, protected from the elements, and somehow made presentable for an audience accustomed to polished corporate displays. "We need a trailer," Rogers muttered, calculating costs in his head. Rental fees, insurance, fuel for the round trip to downtown Detroit, expenses that would consume a significant portion of the shop's already tight operating budget. Mabel Hill found him Tuesday afternoon, hunched over a legal pad covered with sketches and calculations, trying to design a portable mounting system that would showcase the engine's modifications without requiring a forklift to move it. "You look like a man who's bitten off more than he can chew," she observed, settling into the plastic chair beside Rogers's cluttered desk. "Maybe I have," Rogers admitted. "I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if my modifications don't work as well as I think they do? What if I can't explain the technical details to people who've forgotten more about engineering than I'll ever know?" Mabel studied the sketches with the practical eye of someone who'd spent decades solving problems with limited resources. "Your father faced the same kind of doubt when he expanded this place back in '78. Times were tough. Competition was fierce, and everybody told him he was crazy to invest in new equipment when the smart money was pulling out of Detroit. This is different," Rogers said. "Dad was competing with other mechanics. I'm about to go up against corporate engineers with unlimited budgets and teams of researchers." Mabel leaned back in her chair. "Let me ask you something. That Honda you fixed for Mrs. Chun last week, the one 3 other shops said needed a complete rebuild. What did you do differently?" "I listened to the engine. The sound told me it was a sensor problem, not mechanical failure. And those other shops? Why couldn't they hear what you heard?" Rogers paused, understanding where Mabel was leading him. Because they relied on diagnostic computers instead of experience. They ran tests instead of using their ears. Exactly. You think differently than they do. You solve problems they can't solve using knowledge they don't have. That's not a disadvantage, that's your competitive edge. But Mabel's pep talk couldn't address the more practical obstacles. The presentation guidelines Daisy had emailed were intimidating, detailed technical specifications, peer-reviewed documentation, professional quality visual aids, and 20 minutes to explain years of experimental work to an audience that would include some of the most knowledgeable automotive engineers in the world. Rogers had never given a formal presentation in his life. His customer interactions consisted of pointing at engine components and explaining repairs in plain language. The idea of standing before a microphone, facing a panel of judges and an audience of industry professionals, triggered anxiety that kept him awake at night. Wednesday brought another challenge. Lyra Harborfield, a reporter from the Detroit News, called seeking an interview about the local mechanic challenging corporate R&D departments. Apparently, word of Rogers's participation had leaked, and the David versus Goliath narrative was too appealing for the media to ignore. "I'm not comfortable with interviews," Rogers told her. "I'd prefer to let my work speak for itself." "Mr. Gus, this story is going to be told whether you participate or not. Wouldn't you rather have your perspective included?" The interview, conducted in the garage while Rogers worked on a transmission rebuild, felt like an interrogation. Lyra asked probing questions about his qualifications, his funding sources, his expectations for the competition. Each question reinforced Rogers's growing awareness of how outmatched he was in this new arena. "You don't have a degree in mechanical engineering," Lyra observed, consulting her notes. "Most of your competitors have advanced degrees, published research, corporate backing. What makes you think you can compete at their level?" Rogers paused his work, considering the question that had been haunting him since accepting Daisy's invitation. "I've been working with engines since I was 12 years old. I've diagnosed problems that computer systems missed, fixed vehicles that other shops gave up on. Maybe I don't have the credentials, but I have something else, which is experience, intuition, the kind of knowledge you can't get from textbooks. After Lyra left, Rogers felt exposed and vulnerable. The article would appear in 3 days, just before the expo, potentially drawing unwanted attention to his participation. He imagined competitors reading about the backyard mechanic who thought he could revolutionize engine design, their laughter echoing through corporate boardrooms and university labs. Thursday evening brought the final blow to Rogers's confidence. Finch, working on homework at the kitchen table, looked up from his math worksheet with innocent curiosity. "Dad, what if you don't win the contest?" The question hit Rogers like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own fears and insecurities that he hadn't considered what failure would mean for Finch. His son believed Rogers could fix anything, solve any problem, overcome any challenge. What would it do to that faith if Rogers was publicly humiliated by corporate engineers with superior resources and credentials? "Sometimes the most important thing isn't winning," Rogers said carefully. "Sometimes it's having the courage to try." But as he tucked Finch into bed that night, Rogers wondered if courage was enough. In 5 days, he would transport his prototype engine to the convention center, stand before a panel of industry experts, and attempt to prove that grassroots innovation could compete with corporate research and development. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Limited resources, no formal presentation experience, competition from well-funded teams with advanced degrees, and the growing certainty that he was about to embarrass himself in front of the people who shaped the future of automotive technology. What Rogers didn't know was that his greatest obstacle wouldn't be technical or financial. It would be Peregrine Thorne, whose combination of wealth, influence, and casual cruelty would soon turn a professional competition into a personal battle won that would ultimately test not just Rogers's engineering skills, but his belief in the value of experience, intuition, and the kind of mechanical wisdom that couldn't be purchased or programmed. The morning of the article's publication, Rogers arrived at the garage before sunrise, needing the familiar ritual of work to calm his nerves. The Detroit News lay folded on his desk, the headline visible even in the dim light filtering through the windows. Local mechanic takes on corporate giants at Metro Tech Expo. Rogers brewed coffee in the ancient percolator that had served the garage since his father's time, then forced himself to read Lyra Harborfield's article. The piece was fair but stark in its assessment of the challenge ahead. Photographs showed Rogers in his oil-stained work clothes next to corporate headshots of his competitors, PhD engineers in pressed suits, startup founders with venture capital backing, research teams from major universities. The visual contrast was unmistakable. Rogers looked exactly like what he was, a working mechanic who'd stumbled into a world where innovation was measured in patents and peer-reviewed publications, rather than satisfied customers and engines that purred like contented cats. But something in the article's tone sparked defiance rather than despair. Lyra had quoted Dr. Croft extensively, and the university professor's assessment was unequivocal. Mr. Gus has achieved efficiency improvements that our computer models suggested were impossible with conventional combustion chamber designs. His work deserves serious consideration from the automotive industry. Rogers folded the newspaper and walked to his prototype engine. If Dr. Croft believed the modifications were significant, perhaps the gap between grassroots innovation and corporate research wasn't as wide as it appeared. The engine represented thousands of hours of experimentation, failure, adjustment, and breakthrough. Every component told a story of problem-solving that couldn't be replicated in corporate labs or university research facilities. The first step was transportation. Rogers spent Tuesday morning building a custom trailer from salvaged steel and plywood, welding mounting points that would secure the engine stand during transport while allowing easy access for demonstration. The work felt good, physical, tangible, the kind of problem-solving that had clear solutions and measurable results. Mabel Hill appeared around noon with sandwiches and unsolicited advice. "You're overthinking this," she said, watching Rogers fuss over trailer suspension calculations. "These corporate types are impressed by results, not presentations. Show them what your engine can do, explain why it works, and let the performance speak for itself." "Easy for you to say," Rogers replied, tightening a bolt with more force than necessary. "You're not the one who has to stand up there and convince a panel of experts that a mechanic from Eastside figured out something their engineering teams missed." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A black BMW sedan pulled into the garage's parking area, and out stepped a woman in her early 40s wearing a tailored business suit that probably cost more than Rogers's monthly rent. She moved with the confident precision of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms and seven-figure decisions. "Mr. Gus? I'm Ivory Finch, Vice President of Engineering for Thorne Dynamics. I read about your expo participation in this morning's paper." Rogers wiped his hands on his shop rag, suddenly conscious of the grease under his fingernails and the motor oil stains on his shirt. Thorne Dynamics was one of Detroit's most successful automotive technology companies, specializing in performance modifications for luxury vehicles. Their client list included celebrities, professional athletes, and wealthy enthusiasts willing to pay premium prices for exclusive engineering. "What can I do for you?" Rogers asked. Ivory's smile was polished but didn't reach her eyes. "I wanted to see the engine modifications that have generated so much interest." Dr. Croft's comments were quite intriguing. Rogers led her to the prototype, watching as she examined the modified combustion chambers, altered fuel injection timing, and custom intake manifold design. Her questions were technically sophisticated, probing the theoretical foundations of Rogers's empirical modifications. Interesting approach, she said after 20 minutes of detailed examination. Very intuitive. Mr. Thorne would find this fascinating. Mr. Thorne? Peregrine Thorne, our CEO. He'll be judging the Innovation Showcase at the Expo. He has very strong opinions about engineering methodology and the importance of rigorous scientific process. Something in Ivory's tone suggested a warning, though Rogers couldn't interpret the subtext. I look forward to meeting him, he said carefully. I'm sure you do. Ivory handed him an embossed business card. If you're interested in discussing licensing opportunities for your modifications, Thorne Dynamics might be able to offer alternatives to the Expo competition. Mr. Thorne prefers to work with established entities rather than independent inventors. After Ivory left, Rogers felt a chill that had nothing to do with Michigan's October weather. The visit had ostensibly been about business development, but it felt more like reconnaissance a corporate predator. Evaluating potential prey. Wednesday and Thursday were consumed by preparation that felt increasingly inadequate. Rogers practiced his presentation in the empty garage, explaining his modifications to an audience of tool cabinets and hydraulic equipment. The words felt clumsy, technical explanations that sounded perfectly clear in his head, but emerged as jumbled fragments when spoken aloud. The prototype engine's performance data was compelling: 15% improvement in fuel efficiency, 8% increase in power output, 23% reduction in emissions, but Rogers struggled to explain the theoretical principles underlying his empirical discoveries. He understood why the modifications worked through experience and intuition, but translating that knowledge into academic language was like trying to describe music to someone who'd never heard sound. Finch helped with visual aids, drawing diagrams that illustrated airflow patterns and combustion sequences with the clarity that came from an 8-year-old's uncluttered perspective. You're making it too complicated, Dad, he said, erasing a complex mathematical formula Rogers had written on poster board. Just show them how the air moves differently. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and crystalline autumn sky that made Detroit's skyline shimmer like a promise. Rogers loaded the prototype engine onto his homemade trailer, securing it with straps and padding that would protect the modifications during transport. The drive to the convention center took 40 minutes through city streets that traced Detroit's industrial history, past shuttered factories being converted to lofts, through neighborhoods experiencing tentative renewal. Alongside the river that had once powered the machinery of America's automotive dominance, the Metro Tech Expo occupied 3 floors of the convention center, with corporate displays that looked like museum exhibitions and startup booths designed by marketing professionals who understood the psychology of first impressions. Rogers felt like a community theater actor who'd accidentally wandered onto a Broadway stage. His assigned space in the Innovation Showcase was modest but adequate, a 10 by 10 area with electrical outlets, adequate lighting, and enough room for the engine display. Around him, competitors assembled presentations that looked like they'd been designed by teams of engineers and marketing specialists. As Rogers unloaded his equipment, he noticed other participants watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to condescension. These were people who spoke fluent engineering jargon, who'd published research papers and filed patents, who belonged in this world of corporate innovation and venture capital funding. What Rogers didn't know, as he struggled to position his prototype engine for optimal viewing, was that Peregrine Thorne was already circulating through the showcase, evaluating competitors with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd built a fortune by identifying and exploiting other people's weaknesses. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test more than engineering competence. It would examine the fundamental question of whether innovation belonged exclusively to credentialed experts, or whether wisdom could emerge from experience, intuition, and the kind of mechanical empathy that couldn't be taught in universities. or corporate training programs. Rogers had committed himself to this arena. Tomorrow he would discover whether courage and competence were enough to survive corporate predators, who confused wealth with wisdom and credentials with creativity. Saturday morning at the Metro Tech Expo dawned with the kind of electric energy that accompanied high-stakes competition. Rogers arrived at the convention center 2 hours early, needing time to calm his nerves and make final adjustments to his display before the judges began their evaluations. The innovation showcase occupied the entire east wing of the main floor, with 43 entries arranged in a grid pattern that allowed easy navigation for attendees and judges. Corporate sponsors had set up elaborate booths around the perimeter, their displays featuring sleek prototypes, interactive demonstrations, and marketing materials that looked like they'd been designed by Madison Avenue agencies. Rogers' modest setup looked exactly like what it was, the work of a single mechanic with limited resources but unlimited determination. The prototype engine sat on its welded steel stand, surrounded by hand-drawn diagrams, performance charts created on his home computer, and a 3-ring binder containing documentation that he'd typed himself using hunt and peck methods that would have embarrassed a high school student. But the engine itself was undeniably impressive. Under the convention center's bright lighting, the modified components gleamed with the precision of custom machining. Every surface showed evidence of careful craftsmanship, from the hand-polished combustion chambers to the perfectly aligned fuel injection ports that Rogers had calibrated by ear rather than computer analysis. As other participants arrived and began final preparations, Rogers couldn't help but notice the stark differences in presentation quality. The team from Michigan Tech had professional banners, laptop computers running simulation software, and prototype components that looked like they'd been manufactured in aerospace facilities. The startup from Ann Arbor had hired a booth design company, complete with custom lighting and interactive displays that invited hands-on exploration. "Impressive work," said a voice behind him. Rogers turned to find a tall, silver-haired man in an immaculate charcoal suit examining the prototype engine with the focused intensity of someone who understood mechanical systems at a fundamental level. Dr. Miles Taylor, Ford Advanced Engineering. "I've been following your modifications since Dr. Croft's presentation to our research committee." Rogers felt a surge of pride mixed with anxiety. Ford Advanced Engineering represented the pinnacle of automotive research and development. If Dr. Taylor was impressed, perhaps Rogers' work had more merit than his insecurities suggested. "The combustion chamber modifications are particularly intriguing," Dr. Taylor continued, leaning closer to examine the altered geometry. "Our computer model suggested that this configuration should create turbulence problems, but your performance data indicates the opposite." "Sometimes engines don't read the textbooks," Rogers replied, finding confidence in discussing the technical details he understood better than anyone. "The airflow patterns create beneficial swirl characteristics that improve fuel mixing without increasing resistance." Dr. Taylor nodded thoughtfully. "Classic case of empirical discovery preceding theoretical understanding. Some of our best innovations started exactly the same way." As they discussed technical details, Rogers noticed two men in expensive suits observing their conversation from across the aisle. Something about their demeanor, predatory, calculating, made him uncomfortable. When Dr. Taylor excused himself to examine other entries, one of the men approached. "Fascinating conversation," the stranger said with a smile that didn't extend to his eyes. "I'm Lander Croft, Director of Competitive Intelligence for Thorne Dynamics. My colleague and I have been very interested in your work." Rogers recognized the name from corporate automotive news. Thorne Dynamics had built its reputation by acquiring innovative technologies from smaller companies, often through aggressive tactics that bordered on corporate espionage. Lander's interest felt more like threat assessment than professional curiosity. "I understand you've had some impressive performance results," Lander continued. 23% reduction in emissions is quite remarkable for modifications that appear relatively simple. Simple doesn't mean easy, Rogers replied carefully. These modifications represent years of experimentation and refinement. Of course, I'm sure Mr. Thorne will be very interested in your presentation this afternoon. He has strong opinions about innovation methodology and the importance of proper engineering protocols. After Lander moved on, Rogers felt increasingly uneasy. The casual mention of Peregrine Thorne felt less like information and more like intimidation. Combined with Ivory Finch's cryptic visit to his garage, Rogers was beginning to suspect that Thorne Dynamics had more than academic interest in his work. The morning progressed with a steady stream of attendees examining displays and asking questions. Rogers found himself explaining his modifications to automotive journalists, university professors, and engineers from major manufacturers. Most conversations were positive, even enthusiastic, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being evaluated for purposes beyond the competition. Around noon, while Rogers was grabbing a sandwich from the concession area, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. "The fix is already in," said a voice he recognized as Lander Croft. "Thorne's been working the judging panel for weeks. The mechanic doesn't stand a chance, but his modifications are exactly what we need for the military contract." Rogers froze, pretending to study the menu board while straining to hear more. "What about the other entries?" asked Lander's companion. "Michigan Tech's transmission design is interesting, but not commercially viable. The battery startup might be worth watching, but their technology is still 5 years from market readiness. The mechanic's engine modifications are the only real breakthrough in the showcase. And Thorne's confident he can acquire the technology one way or another. If the mechanic won't license willingly, there are other approaches. Patent law is complicated when dealing with empirical discoveries that lack theoretical documentation." Rogers felt his stomach drop. The conversation revealed a level of corporate manipulation that transformed the competition from fair evaluation to predetermined outcome. Thorne wasn't just judging the innovations, he was positioning himself to acquire promising technologies, regardless of the official results. Walking back to his display, Rogers's mind raced through options. He could confront the judges, expose Thorne's manipulation, demand investigation of the judging process. But who would believe a mechanic from East Side versus a wealthy CEO with political connections and corporate influence? Alternatively, he could proceed with his presentation, knowing the competition was rigged, but hoping that public exposure might protect his work from corporate appropriation. The media attention Lyra Harborfield's article had generated meant that hundreds of people would witness his demonstration. Creating documentation that might complicate any attempt to steal his innovations, Rogers chose a third option. He would present his work exactly as planned, but he would also document everything, every conversation, every judge's reaction, every indication of bias or predetermined outcome. If Thorne wanted to steal his modifications, Rogers would make sure the theft was as public and visible as possible. That afternoon, as the judging began and competitors prepared for their presentations, Rogers felt the weight of a decision that extended beyond personal ambition. He was defending not just his own work, but the principle that innovation belonged to those who created it, regardless of their credentials or corporate backing. What Rogers didn't know was that Peregrine Thorne was already planning a public humiliation, designed to discredit both Rogers and his modifications, ensuring that any subsequent acquisition would appear justified rather than predatory. The confrontation ahead would test more than engineering competence. It would examine whether integrity could survive in an arena where wealth and influence typically determined outcomes. Rogers had discovered the game was rigged. Now he had to decide whether to play by the established rules or write new ones. The judging began at 2 o'clock sharp. with a panel of 5 automotive industry luminaries making their way through the innovation showcase in predetermined order. Rogers watched from his position as they evaluated earlier entries, noting their professional demeanor and the respectful attention they gave each presentation. Dr. Miles Taylor from Ford served as the panel's technical expert, asking probing questions about engineering methodology and theoretical foundations. Dr. Linda Croft represented academic perspectives, focusing on research applications and peer review potential. The other judges included executives from General Motors, Stellantis, and Rogers felt his stomach tighten. Peregrine Thorne from Thorne Dynamics. Thorne stood out immediately, not just for his expensive tailoring and obvious wealth, but for his demeanor. While other judges engaged respectfully with each presenter, Thorne radiated dismissive superiority, asking pointed questions, designed more to demonstrate his knowledge than to understand the innovations being presented. Rogers had positioned himself to observe Thorne's interactions with other competitors. At the Michigan Tech transmission display, Thorne spent less than 5 minutes, interrupting the student presenter with comments like, "That's been tried before," and "commercially impractical." The startup's battery technology received similarly cursory treatment, with Thorne questioning funding sources and manufacturing scalability rather than technical merit. When the judges reached Rogers's display, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Dr. Taylor and Dr. Croft showed genuine interest, examining the modified combustion chambers and asking detailed questions about airflow dynamics and fuel injection timing. But Thorne approached with the predatory smile of someone who'd already decided the outcome. "So," Thorne said loudly enough for surrounding competitors and attendees to hear, "this is the famous backyard mechanic who thinks he can revolutionize engine design." His tone carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to using wealth and position as weapons. Rogers felt every eye in the vicinity turned toward him. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Rogers Gus. Thank you for taking time to evaluate my work." Thorne's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Work? Is that what we're calling this?" He gestured toward the prototype engine with theatrical disdain. "I see a collection of amateur modifications to a basic V6 platform. Where's the computer modeling? The computational fluid dynamics analysis? The peer-reviewed research methodology?" Dr. Croft attempted to intervene. "Mr. Thorne, perhaps we should examine the performance data before making assessments. Mr. Gus has achieved some remarkable efficiency improvements." "Performance data," Thorne repeated mockingly. "Gathered how? With what equipment? Under what controlled conditions?" He turned to Rogers with predatory focus. "Tell me, Mr. Gus, what's your educational background? Where did you study thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, combustion chemistry?" Rogers felt the weight of everyone's attention: judges, competitors, media representatives, industry professionals who'd gathered to witness the evaluation. This was the moment Thorne had orchestrated, the public humiliation designed to discredit both Rogers and his innovations. "I don't have formal engineering education," Rogers replied steadily. "I learned by working with engines, listening to them, understanding what they needed." Thorne's smile turned predatory. "Listening to engines? Ladies and gentlemen, we have a mechanic who thinks internal combustion operates on mystical principles rather than scientific ones." His laughter was echoed by several onlookers who seemed to enjoy the spectacle of an outsider being put in his place. But something in Thorne's performance felt too rehearsed, too calculated. Rogers realized this wasn't spontaneous dismissal. It was deliberate theater designed to discredit his work before anyone could properly evaluate it. "Mr. Thorne," Rogers said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 30 years of solving problems others couldn't, "would you like to see what these modifications actually accomplish?" "Oh, this should be entertaining," Thorne replied, crossing his arms with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "Please demonstrate your magical listening technique." Rogers had prepared for this moment, though not in the way Thorne expected. He'd brought a laptop computer borrowed from the public library loaded with audio files and frequency analysis software that Finch had helped him learn to operate. "Every engine has a signature," Rogers began, connecting the laptop to a small speaker system. "Healthy engines produce specific harmonic patterns. When something's wrong, those patterns change." He played an audio file, the rough idle of an engine with timing problems. "Fascinating," Thorne said sarcastically. "A recording of a broken engine. And this proves what exactly?" Rogers played a second file, the same engine after timing adjustment, its idle smooth and steady. Even to untrained ears, the difference was obvious. "That's the same engine, before and after repair. Most mechanics would replace components based on diagnostic computer recommendations. I listened to what the engine was telling me and adjusted. Timing by ear." Dr. Taylor leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Gus, are you suggesting that acoustic analysis could supplement computerized diagnostics?" "I'm suggesting that computers can miss things that experience can detect. This prototype engine incorporates modifications based on acoustic feedback that revealed inefficiencies in conventional designs." Rogers activated the prototype, its modified V6 settling into an idle that was noticeably different from standard configurations. The sound was smoother, more consistent, with harmonic characteristics that even non-experts could recognize as superior. "Impressive sound quality," Dr. Croft observed. "But how do we quantify the improvements?" Rogers had anticipated this question. From his documentation folder, he produced dyno charts, emissions test results, and fuel efficiency data gathered at an independent testing facility. 15% improvement in fuel economy, 8% increase in power output, 23% reduction in emissions. Thorne examined the documents with the expression of someone looking for flaws to exploit. These tests were conducted. Where? By whom? Under what certification standards? Henderson Automotive Testing in Dearborn. ACE certified facility, EPA approved emissions equipment. For the first time, Thorne's confidence seemed to waver. Henderson was a respected facility that regularly performed certification work for major manufacturers. Their documentation couldn't be easily dismissed as amateur hour measurements. But Thorne quickly recovered, seizing on a different angle of attack. "Even assuming these results are accurate, which I doubt, they represent incremental improvements to obsolete technology. The future belongs to electric vehicles, not antiquated internal combustion modifications." "With respect, Mr. Thorne," Rogers replied, "internal combustion engines will power transportation for decades to come. Improving their efficiency isn't obsolete, it's essential." Rogers then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of continuing to defend his work against Thorne's attacks, he began explaining the modifications with the same patient clarity he'd used to teach Finch about engines. "This combustion chamber modification creates beneficial turbulence patterns," he said, pointing to specific design elements. "The swirl improves fuel mixing without increasing pumping losses. Most engineering approaches try to eliminate turbulence, but controlled turbulence can actually enhance efficiency." Dr. Taylor was taking notes, asking follow-up questions about implementation challenges and scalability. Dr. Croft requested permission to examine the modified components more closely. Even judges from other companies showed genuine interest in the technical details. But Thorne wasn't finished. "Mr. Gus, these modifications might work in a controlled environment, but real-world applications present challenges that backyard experiments can't address. Manufacturing tolerances, material science, durability testing, these require resources and expertise that individual mechanics simply don't possess." Rogers nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right about manufacturing challenges. But innovation often starts with proof of concept before addressing production scalability. The Wright brothers didn't solve commercial aviation in their bicycle shop, but they proved powered flight was possible. The comparison drew murmurs of approval from the growing crowd of observers. Thorne's expression darkened as he realized his intimidation tactics weren't achieving their intended effect. "Mr. Gus," Thorne said with barely controlled anger, comparing yourself to the Wright brothers is presumptuous in the extreme. They were serious inventors working with scientific methodology. You're a mechanic playing with junkyard parts. The insult hung in the air like a physical presence. Rogers felt the familiar anger that came from being dismissed by people who confused credentials with competence, wealth with wisdom. But instead of responding with emotion, he drew on the patience his father had taught him when dealing with difficult customers. "Mr. Thorne, I'm not comparing myself to anyone. I'm simply sharing modifications that work, hoping they might contribute something useful to automotive engineering. If that offends you, I apologize." The gracious response made Thorne's hostility appear even more inappropriate. Other judges began asking technical questions that drew attention away from the personal conflict and back to the engineering merits of Rogers's work. As the formal evaluation concluded and judges moved to the next entry, Rogers felt a complex mixture of emotions. He'd survived Thorne's attempted humiliation, demonstrated his modifications effectively, and earned respectful attention from serious automotive professionals. But Thorne's parting words carried an unmistakable threat. "Enjoy your moment in the spotlight, Mr. Gus. In this industry, amateur hour doesn't last long." Rogers watched Thorne walk away, recognizing that the confrontation was far from over. The CEO had failed to discredit the modifications publicly, which meant he'd likely pursue other methods of acquiring or neutralizing technology he clearly considered valuable. What Rogers didn't know was that among the crowd of observers who'd witnessed the exchange was Isabella Romano, chief engineering consultant for Ferrari North America, who'd been taking detailed notes not just about the technical specifications, but about Rogers's approach to problem-solving under pressure. The breakthrough wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Rogers had demonstrated that innovation could emerge from experience and intuition, that listening to engines was as valid as computer modeling, and that humility in the face of arrogance could be its own form of strength. Tomorrow would bring consequences neither Rogers nor Thorne could anticipate, starting with a phone call from Maranello that would validate everything Rogers believed about the relationship between mechanics and machines. The hours following the presentation passed in a blur of handshakes, business cards, and conversations that felt surreal to Rogers. Word of the confrontation with Peregrine Thorne had spread quickly through the convention center, transforming Rogers from anonymous participant into the expo's most discussed story. Lyra Harborfield from the Detroit News appeared first, her recorder already running as she approached Rogers's display. "Mr. Gus, I witnessed the exchange with Mr. Thorne. His comments seemed unusually hostile for a professional evaluation. Any thoughts on why he responded so aggressively?" Rogers wiped his hands on his shop rag, a nervous habit that grounded him when conversations moved beyond his comfort zone. "I can't speak to Mr. Thorne's motivations. I'm just here to share my work and see if it might contribute something useful to automotive engineering." But his dismissal of your modifications as amateur hour, that had to sting, especially given your performance results. "Results speak for themselves," Rogers replied diplomatically. "If the modifications help engines run more efficiently, that's what matters." But Lyra wasn't the only journalist interested in the story. By late afternoon, Rogers found himself fielding questions from automotive trade publications, technology blogs, and local television news. The narrative was irresistible. Humble mechanic versus arrogant CEO. Grassroots innovation challenging corporate orthodoxy. Dr. Miles Taylor approached as the final interviews concluded. "Mr. Gus, I wanted to follow up on your presentation. Ford's Advanced Engineering Group would be interested in conducting independent testing of your modifications. Would you be open to that? Rogers felt a surge of validation mixed with anxiety. Ford's interest suggested his work had genuine merit, but corporate involvement brought complications he wasn't prepared to navigate. I'd be honored to have Ford evaluate the modifications. What would that process involve? We'd need access to detailed specifications, manufacturing drawings, implementation protocols. Our testing facility could validate your performance claims under controlled conditions and explore scalability for production applications. That sounds reasonable. I'll need to review any agreements carefully. I'm not familiar with corporate licensing procedures. Dr. Taylor smiled. Understandable. I'll have our legal department prepare standard evaluation agreements. Nothing binding, just protection for both parties during the assessment phase. As the convention center began to empty, Rogers started dismantling his display with the satisfaction of someone who'd survived a challenge that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. The judging results wouldn't be announced until the following morning. But Rogers felt he'd accomplished something more important than winning a competition. He'd proven that his modifications deserved serious consideration from automotive professionals. Sense of accomplishment lasted exactly 47 minutes. Rogers was loading the prototype engine onto his trailer when Landercroft appeared, flanked by two men in dark suits who radiated the kind of professional menace that came with corporate security backgrounds. "Mr. Gus," Lander said with a smile that contained no warmth. "Quite a performance this afternoon. Mr. Thorne was very impressed with your modifications." "He had an interesting way of showing it," Rogers replied, continuing to secure the engine with straps and padding. "Mr. Thorne's presentation style can be direct, but he recognizes valuable technology when he sees it. Thorne Dynamics would like to discuss acquisition opportunities for your modifications." Rogers straightened, sensing threat beneath Lander's corporate politeness. "I'm not interested in selling. If Ford's evaluation goes well, I might consider licensing arrangements, but I intend to retain ownership of my work." Lander's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Gus, I think you misunderstand your position. Patent law regarding empirical discoveries is quite complex, especially when dealing with modifications that lack theoretical documentation. Independent inventors often find themselves at significant disadvantage in intellectual property disputes." The threat was barely veiled. Rogers felt his anger rising, the same protective instinct that had driven him to defend Finch from schoolyard bullies and Eastside Automotive from corporate chain stores that tried to undercut local businesses. "Are you threatening me?" Rogers asked quietly. "Threatening? Not at all. Simply explaining realities that many independent inventors discover too late. Patent litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and often decided by factors other than technical merit. Established companies with experienced legal departments have significant advantages." One of Lander's companions stepped closer, close enough that Rogers could smell his cologne and see the bulge of something metallic beneath his jacket. "Mr. Gus, Mr. Thorne is prepared to offer very generous licensing terms. Much more generous than you're likely to receive elsewhere." Rogers looked at the three men, recognizing the dynamic from countless movies and television shows, but never imagining he'd experience corporate intimidation firsthand. The irony wasn't lost on him. His modifications were apparently valuable. Enough to steal, but not valuable enough to respect. "I'll consider any legitimate offers," Rogers said carefully, "through proper legal channels with appropriate documentation and independent review." Lander's smile returned, predatory and cold. "Of course. Take your time deciding. But remember, opportunities like this don't last indefinitely." After they left, Rogers sat in his truck for several minutes, hands trembling slightly from the confrontation. The validation of Ford's interest and the media attention felt hollow against the reality of corporate predators who viewed innovation as territory to be conquered rather than progress to be celebrated. The drive home took him through Detroit's industrial heart, past factories that had once defined American manufacturing in neighborhoods that had survived decades of economic uncertainty. Rogers drew strength from the landscape's resilience, from communities that had adapted and endured despite challenges that seemed insurmountable. Back at Eastside Automotive, Rogers found Finch waiting with homework spread across the office desk. Surrounded by the comfortable chaos of invoice pads, parts catalogs, and the coffee-stained paperwork that accumulated in any small business. "How did it go, Dad?" Finch asked, looking up from math worksheets that seemed to involve more erasing than writing. Rogers settled into the plastic chair beside his son, feeling the day's stress begin to ease in the familiar environment of his garage. "It went well, buddy. Some people were very interested in the engine modifications. Did you win? Won't know until tomorrow. But winning isn't always the most important thing." Finch nodded with the sage wisdom that 8-year-olds sometimes possessed. "Like when Tommy Martinez said I couldn't fix his bike chain, but I did it anyway even though he didn't say sorry." Exactly like that. That evening, after Finch was asleep, Rogers sat in the garage with his prototype engine, running his hands over modifications that represented years of experimentation and discovery. The confrontation with Thorne had clarified something important. This wasn't just about engineering anymore. It was about the right of individual innovators to benefit from their work, about whether corporate power could simply appropriate ideas that emerged from outside established hierarchies. Rogers opened his laptop and began documenting everything. Technical specifications, the performance data, the development process, and especially the details of his confrontations with Thorne Dynamics representatives. If corporate lawyers wanted to challenge his work, he'd make sure the record was as complete and public as possible. Around midnight, as Rogers was finishing his documentation, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, with an international prefix that made him hesitate before answering. "Mr. Gus?" The voice carried a slight accent, European but cultured. "This is Isabella Romano calling from Ferrari, North America. I was present at your presentation this afternoon at the Metro Tech Expo." Rogers felt his breath catch. Ferrari's interest in his work seemed impossible, like receiving a call from automotive royalty. "I hope I'm not calling too late," Isabella continued. "But I wanted to reach you before you committed to any exclusive arrangements with other manufacturers. Your modifications have generated considerable excitement among our engineering team." "Ferrari is interested in my work?" Rogers asked, still processing the impossibility of the conversation. "Very much so, Mr. Gus. We've been struggling with efficiency challenges and our naturally aspirated engines regulations are pushing us toward forced induction. But our customers prefer the sound and character of atmospheric power plants. Your combustion chamber modifications might provide exactly the efficiency improvements we need." Rogers looked at his prototype engine, suddenly seeing it not as a collection of experimental parts, but as a bridge between grassroots innovation and the pinnacle of automotive engineering. What would Ferrari's interest involve? Initially, detailed technical consultation and independent testing at our facility in Maranello. If the modifications prove scalable to our applications, we'd discuss licensing arrangements that would provide substantial compensation while allowing you to retain ownership of your innovations. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Isabella explaining Ferrari's technical challenges and Rogers describing his development process. By the time they concluded, Rogers had agreed to a conference call with Ferrari's engineering team the following week. After hanging up, Rogers sat in the quiet garage, contemplating the transformation that had occurred in less than 24 hours. This morning, he'd been a small-town mechanic preparing for a competition that seemed beyond his abilities. Tonight, he was fielding calls from Ferrari and facing pressure from corporate predators who recognized the value of what he'd created. Tomorrow would bring the judging results, more media attention, and continued pressure from Thorne Dynamics. But Ferrari's interest had changed the fundamental dynamics of the situation. Rogers was no longer an isolated inventor hoping for recognition. He was a player in a game where automotive legends competed for innovations that could reshape the industry. The phone call from Maranello had validated everything Rogers believed about the relationship between mechanics and machines, about the value of listening to engines rather than simply commanding them. But it had also introduced new challenges that would test not just his technical skills, but his ability to navigate corporate politics and protect innovations that could benefit the entire automotive world. What Rogers didn't know was that Peregrine Thorne had also heard about Ferrari's interest and was already planning a response that would escalate their conflict from professional competition to personal warfare. The announcement ceremony for the Metro Tech Expo Awards took place in the convention center's main auditorium with an audience of industry professionals, media representatives, and competitors who'd spent 3 days showcasing their innovations. Rogers sat in the third row, feeling distinctly out of place among the suits and corporate badges that dominated the gathering. Daisy Barnes took the podium with the practiced confidence of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of similar events. Ladies and gentlemen, this year's competition featured exceptional innovation across multiple automotive technologies. Our judges faced difficult decisions in evaluating 43 outstanding entries. Rogers felt his stomach tighten as Daisy began announcing category winners. Third place in the innovation showcase went to the battery startup from Ann Arbor. Second place was awarded to Michigan Tech's transmission research team. Each announcement brought polite applause and brief presentations by the winners. And this year's winner of the Innovation Showcase, along with the $20,000 prize for breakthrough engineering, is ... Daisy paused for dramatic effect, scanning the audience with a smile that seemed to settle directly on Rogers. Rogers Gus of Eastside Automotive, for revolutionary combustion chamber modifications that achieve significant efficiency improvements using empirical engineering methods. The applause was thunderous, but Rogers barely heard it through the rushing in his ears. He stood on unsteady legs and made his way to the podium, aware that hundreds of eyes were tracking his movement. This was the moment he'd dreamed of but never quite believed possible: public recognition that his work had value beyond the cramped confines of his garage. "Mr. Gus," Daisy said as she handed him the award plaque, "would you like to say a few words?" Rogers approached the microphone, looking out at an audience that included automotive executives, university professors, and journalists whose coverage would reach thousands of readers. For a moment, his mind went completely blank. Then he saw Peregrine Thorne in the fifth row, his expression a mixture of rage and calculation that made Rogers' decision easy. "Thank you," Rogers began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "This recognition means more than I can express, but it's not really about me. It's about the idea that innovation can come from anywhere, from corporate laboratories, university research centers, or small garages where mechanics listen to what engines are trying to tell them." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "Yesterday, someone suggested that my work represented amateur hour because it didn't follow conventional development protocols. But engines don't care about protocols. They respond to understanding, patience, and the willingness to hear what they're actually saying rather than what we think they should be saying." Rogers paused, looking directly at Thorne. The future of automotive engineering isn't about choosing between corporate resources and grassroots innovation. It's about combining both, using sophisticated tools and unlimited budgets to explore possibilities that individual inventors discover through experience and intuition. The applause that followed was different from the polite acknowledgement that had greeted other winners. This was the kind of sustained ovation that indicated genuine appreciation for words that resonated beyond mere courtesy. As Rogers returned to his seat, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your award. This is Isabella Romano from Ferrari. We'd like to make a public statement regarding our interest in your modifications. Are you available for a brief conference call?" Rogers stepped into the corridor outside the auditorium and called Isabella back. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but when it ended, Rogers knew that everything had changed. When he returned to the auditorium, Daisy Barnes was concluding the ceremony with acknowledgments of sponsors and judges. As the audience began to disperse, Rogers found himself surrounded by congratulations, business cards, and requests for interviews that would have overwhelmed him just days earlier. But before he could process the attention, Peregrine Thorne appeared at his elbow. "Congratulations, Mr. Gus," Thorne said with a smile that looked like it had been carved from ice. "Quite an upset victory. I hope you understand that winning a local competition doesn't qualify you for the major leagues of automotive engineering." "Actually, Mr. Thorne," Rogers replied calmly, "I think it does." Rogers pulled out his phone and activated the speaker function, then called Isabella Romano back. "Isabella, you're on speaker. Could you repeat what you just told me for Mr. Thorne's benefit?" Isabella's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker, her accent lending additional authority to words that would reshape the conversation. "Entirely, certainly. Ferrari's engineering team has completed preliminary analysis of Mr. Gus's combustion chamber modifications. We believe they represent the most significant breakthrough in naturally aspirated engine efficiency we've seen in a decade. We're prepared to offer immediate licensing arrangements and are considering implementation in our next-generation V12 platforms." The corridor had gone completely quiet. Peregrine Thorne's face cycled through several expressions before settling. Unbarely controlled fury. Isabella continued, "Mr. Gus, we'd also like to invite you to visit our facility in Maranello as our guest, to consult with our engineering team about adaptation challenges and potential improvements to your design." Rogers thanked Isabella and ended the call, then turned to face Thorne with the quiet confidence that came from having his work validated by one of the world's most prestigious automotive manufacturers. "Mr. Thorne," Rogers said softly, "I believe this qualifies as the major leagues." Thorne's response was swift and vicious. "This isn't over, Gus. Patent law is complex, and independent inventors often discover that corporate legal departments have advantages that amateur mechanics can't match." But before Rogers could respond, Dr. Miles Taylor from Ford stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, Ford's legal department has already begun preparing protective documentation for Mr. Gus's innovations. Given Ferrari's public endorsement and the media attention surrounding this technology, any challenges to his intellectual property rights would face significant scrutiny." Other voices joined the support. Dr. Linda Croft mentioning university interest, automotive journalists discussing publication plans, and industry professionals expressing enthusiasm for innovations that emerged from practical experience rather than theoretical modeling. Thorne found himself isolated in a corridor full of people who'd witnessed his attempt to intimidate an individual inventor and who were now actively supporting that inventor's right to benefit from his own discoveries. "This conversation is over," Thorne said tersely, then stalked away with the wounded pride of someone who'd badly miscalculated the dynamics of a situation he'd thought he controlled. Rogers stood in the corridor, surrounded by people who understood that what they'd witnessed was larger than a single competition or individual achievement. It was validation of the principle that innovation belonged to those who created it, that corporate power couldn't simply appropriate ideas that emerged from outside established hierarchies. The award ceremony had ended exactly as Rogers had hoped, not just with recognition of his technical achievements, but with public acknowledgement that grassroots Innovation deserved protection and respect rather than exploitation and dismissal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Rogers navigated opportunities with Ferrari, Ford, and other manufacturers who recognized the value of his modifications. But tonight, standing in the convention center corridor with validation ringing in his ears and his son's proud voice on the phone congratulating him, Rogers Gus felt like he'd won something more important than any competition. He'd proven that listening to engines was as valid as computer modeling. That experience could triumph over credentials, and that sometimes the most important innovations emerged not from corporate laboratories, but from small garages, where mechanics understood that machines had voices worth hearing. 3 months after the Metro Tech Expo, Rogers Gus stood in the same garage where his journey had begun, but everything had changed. The space itself looked remarkably similar, the same oil-stained concrete floors, the same hand-painted Eastside Automotive sign, the same collection of tools that had served 3 generations of mechanics. But the subtle differences told a story of transformation that went far beyond surface. Appearances, new diagnostic equipment occupied one corner of the garage. State-of-the-art machinery that complemented rather than replaced Rogers's intuitive approach to engine analysis. A dedicated workstation housed computer systems that allowed him to document and share his innovations with automotive engineers across the globe. Most significantly, a small conference area had been created where Rogers could meet with the steady stream of industry professionals who now sought his expertise. The morning began, as always, with coffee brewed in the ancient percolator and the familiar ritual of reviewing the day's work schedule. But instead of struggling to pay bills and wondering where the next customer would come from, Rogers now faced the pleasant challenge of managing opportunities that seemed to multiply faster than he could evaluate them. Ferrari's licensing agreement had provided immediate financial security, more money than Rogers had imagined possible from his experimental modifications. The Italian manufacturer had not only validated his technical achievements, but had also insisted on publicity that positioned Rogers as a legitimate innovator rather than a lucky amateur. When Ferrari called someone a genius, the automotive world paid attention. Ford's subsequent partnership had brought different benefits. Dr. Miles Taylor's team had spent weeks at Eastside Automotive, studying Rogers's development process and learning to integrate acoustic analysis with traditional engineering protocols. The collaboration had resulted in improvements to Rogers's original design and new modifications that addressed challenges he hadn't even recognized. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the steady flow of customers who sought Rogers's expertise, not just for routine repairs, but for complex diagnostic challenges that had stumped other mechanics and even dealership service departments. Word had spread through the automotive community that the mechanic from Detroit's East Side could solve problems that computer systems couldn't detect. Finch had adapted to their transformed circumstances with the resilience that 8-year-olds possessed in abundance. His father's success had brought new opportunities, better schools, educational programs, experiences that had been impossible when money was tight. But the boy had also maintained his curiosity about engines and his determination to understand the mechanical world that had shaped his family's identity. "Dad," Finch said, looking up from homework that now included advanced mathematics and science courses, "Mrs. Rodriguez says her grandson wants to learn about engines. Can I teach him what you taught me?" Rogers smiled, recognizing the generational pattern that had defined their family. "What do you think is the most important thing to teach him?" "How to listen," Finch replied without hesitation. "Engines tell you everything you need to know, but most people don't know how to hear them." The answer reflected understanding that went beyond mechanical knowledge. Finch had absorbed not just technical skills, but the philosophical approach that distinguished Rogers's work from conventional automotive repair. The boy understood that fixing engines was about relationship and communication, not just replacement of worn components. That afternoon brought a visitor who represented the most unexpected development in Rogers's transformed life. Ivory Finch, from Thorne Dynamics, arrived without the corporate entourage that had accompanied her previous visits, driving a modest sedan rather than the luxury vehicles typically associated with executive transportation. "Mr. Gus," she said as Rogers wiped his hands on his shop rag, "I hope you have a few minutes to talk. I have something important to discuss." Rogers led her to the conference area, noting the tension in her demeanor that suggested personal rather than corporate business. "What can I do for you?" "I want to apologize for my company's behavior during the expo competition. Mr. Thorne's attempts to intimidate you were inappropriate and unprofessional. They didn't represent the values that originally attracted me to automotive engineering." Rogers studied her carefully, recognizing sincerity mixed with professional frustration. "I appreciate that. Corporate politics can be complicated. More than complicated. Toxic. Mr. Thorne's approach to innovation focuses on acquisition and control rather than development and collaboration. After watching how Ferrari and Ford have worked with you, I've realized there are better ways to advance automotive technology." Ivory paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever she planned to say next. "I'm leaving Thorne Dynamics to start my own consulting firm, focused on supporting independent inventors and small-scale innovation. I wondered if you might be interested in collaborative arrangements." The proposal intrigued Rogers for reasons that went beyond business opportunity. Throughout his journey from struggling mechanic to recognized innovator, he'd been struck by the isolation that many inventors faced when dealing with corporate bureaucracies and legal complexities. A consulting firm that supported independent innovation could address challenges he'd experienced firsthand. "What kind of collaboration did you have in mind?" "Technical consulting, patent protection, licensing negotiation services that help inventors focus on innovation rather than business development. I have corporate experience you lack, and you have innovative instincts that corporate environments often suppress." Rogers nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be interested in exploring that, but I want to maintain my primary focus here, in this garage, working with engines and teaching people who want to learn." "Absolutely. The goal would be to support your work, not redirect it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Dr. Linda Croft from Wayne State University, accompanied by a young woman Rogers didn't recognize. "Rogers," Dr. Croft said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Chun, one of my graduate students. She's writing her thesis on empirical engineering methods and would love to interview you about your development process." Sarah stepped forward with the nervous enthusiasm of someone meeting a professional hero. "Mr. Gus, your work represents exactly the kind of innovation I'm researching, practical solutions that emerge from experience rather than theoretical modeling. Would you be willing to share your methodology?" Rogers found himself in the surreal position of being treated as an academic subject worthy of scholarly research. 6 months earlier, he'd been struggling to pay rent. Now university students were writing theses about his approach to engine modification. "I'd be happy to help," Rogers replied, "but I'm not sure my methods qualify as formal methodology. I just listen to engines and try to understand what they need." "That's exactly what makes your work so significant," Sarah said earnestly. "You've developed systematic approaches to empirical analysis that could revolutionize automotive diagnostics." As the afternoon progressed, Rogers found himself explaining his modifications to an audience that now included automotive professionals, university researchers, and potential business partners. The conversation ranged from technical specifications to philosophical questions about the relationship between human intuition and mechanical systems. Mabel Hill arrived during the discussion, carrying her usual offering of coffee and sandwiches along with the practical wisdom that had guided Rogers through months of uncertainty. "Sounds like you're turning this garage into a university," she observed with gentle amusement. Maybe that's what it's always been, Rogers replied. A place where people learn by doing rather than just studying. The comments sparked extended discussion about education, innovation, and the value of hands-on learning in an increasingly digital world. Dr. Croft mentioned university interest in developing programs that combined theoretical knowledge with practical application. Sarah talked about research that validated the importance of sensory analysis in mechanical diagnosis. Ivory described corporate training programs that could benefit from Rogers's approach to problem-solving. As evening approached and visitors began to depart, Rogers found himself alone with Finch in the garage that had become an unlikely center of automotive innovation. The prototype engine still occupied its place of honor, but it was now surrounded by documentation, correspondence, and equipment that reflected Rogers's expanded role in the automotive community. "Dad," Finch said, organizing tools with the methodical precision he'd inherited from his father, "do you miss the way things used to be?" The question surprised Rogers with its perceptiveness. "What do you mean?" "When it was just us working on cars without all these people wanting to talk about business and patents and stuff." Rogers considered the question carefully. The garage had indeed become busier, more complicated, filled with opportunities and obligations that hadn't existed before the expo. Success had brought benefits, but also pressures that sometimes felt overwhelming. "I miss the simplicity," Rogers admitted, "but I don't miss worrying about paying rent or wondering if we'd have enough money for your school supplies. And I like that people are starting to understand that mechanics can be innovators too." Finch nodded with 8-year-old solemnity. "Mrs. Rodriguez says you're famous now. Maybe a little bit. But fame isn't the important part. What is?" Rogers looked around the garage, seeing it through his son's eyes, not as a business or a research facility, but as a place where broken things were made whole, where problems were solved through patience and understanding, where the relationship between humans and machines was celebrated rather than simply exploited. "The important part is that we're still here, still fixing engines, still teaching people that listening is as important as knowing. The rest is just ... extra." That evening, after Finch had gone to bed, Rogers sat in the quiet garage reviewing the day's events. Phone calls from Ferrari engineers seeking consultation on new projects. Email from Ford requesting collaboration on diagnostic software development. Messages from automotive journalists wanting interviews about his latest innovations. But the conversation that stayed with him was Finch's question about missing the way things used to be. Success had brought remarkable opportunities, but it had also introduced complexities that sometimes obscured the simple satisfaction of making broken engines run smoothly again. Rogers walked to his prototype engine and ran his hands over modifications that had started this journey. The metal was cool under his fingers, each component representing hours of experimentation and discovery. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, corporate meetings, technical consultations, business decisions that would shape his future in the automotive industry. But tonight, in the familiar silence of the garage his grandfather had built, Rogers felt the peace that came from knowing he'd remained true to the principles that had guided his transformation. He was still the mechanic who listened to engines, still the teacher who shared knowledge freely, still the father who wanted to give his son a better life. The garage had become a bridge between worlds, connecting grassroots innovation with corporate resources, individual creativity with institutional support, practical wisdom with theoretical knowledge. It was exactly what Rogers had always believed automotive innovation could be, a collaboration between human understanding and mechanical possibility, guided by respect for both tradition and progress. Success hadn't changed who Rogers was. It had simply given him a bigger stage on which to demonstrate what he'd always known, that the best innovations emerged not from corporate laboratories or university research centers, but from the patient work of people who understood that machines had voices worth hearing and who possessed the humility to listen. 5 years after the Metro Tech Expo, the automotive world had quietly adopted a new phrase, the Gus method. It appeared in engineering textbooks, corporate training manuals, and university curricula as shorthand for diagnostic approaches that combine traditional mechanical intuition with modern analytical tools. Rogers himself found the terminology amusing, since he'd never considered his approach to be a formal methodology, just the natural evolution of lessons his father had taught him about listening to engines. The changes were most visible at Eastside Automotive, which had evolved into something unprecedented in the automotive repair industry. The garage still fixed neighborhood cars and solved diagnostic puzzles that stumped dealership service departments, but it had also become an unofficial training center where mechanics, engineers, and students came to learn acoustic analysis, techniques that couldn't be taught through conventional education. Rogers stood in the expanded facility they'd purchased the building next door and created a proper classroom, watching Finch demonstrate fuel injection timing to a group that included 2 Ford engineers, a graduate student from MIT, and Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, who was now 13 and possessed an ear for engine diagnostics that rivaled mechanics with decades of experience. The key, Finch explained with the patient authority of someone who'd grown up around engines, is understanding that every sound means something. This misfire isn't random, it's telling us exactly which cylinder has problems and what kind of problems they are. At 13, Finch had inherited not just his father's mechanical intuition, but also his teaching ability. The boy could explain complex concepts in simple language, helping university-trained engineers understand principles they'd studied theoretically, but never experienced practically. Rogers felt the familiar pride that came from watching his son master skills that connected them to 3 generations of automotive innovation. But he also recognized something new in Finch's approach, a sophistication that came from growing up in an environment where grassroots innovation was valued alongside formal education. The afternoon brought a visitor who represented the most satisfying development in Rogers's journey from struggling mechanic to recognized innovator. Isabella Romano from Ferrari arrived with documents that would formalize a partnership Rogers had never imagined possible 5 years earlier. "Rogers," Isabella said, settling into the conference room that had once been a storage closet filled with old tires and forgotten parts, "Maranello has approved the collaboration we've been discussing. Ferrari's North American Engineering Center wants to establish a permanent research partnership with Eastside Automotive." The proposal was extraordinary. Ferrari would fund expansion of Rogers's facility, provide access to cutting-edge diagnostic equipment, and create a formal program where Ferrari engineers would spend months learning acoustic analysis techniques that had revolutionized their approach to engine development. What would this mean practically? Rogers asked, still processing the magnitude of what Isabella was describing. "It means Ferrari recognizes that innovation doesn't only happen in corporate laboratories. Some of our most significant breakthroughs have come from incorporating your methodologies into our development process. We want to institutionalize that collaboration." Rogers looked through the conference room window at the garage where his father had taught him to listen to engines, where he'd raised Finch to understand that mechanical systems were conversations rather than commands, where they'd proven that experience and intuition could compete with unlimited corporate resources. "I'm honored by Ferrari's interest," Rogers said carefully. "But I want to maintain what we've built here, the community connections, the teaching programs, the focus on practical solutions rather than just technological advancement." Isabella smiled. "That's exactly why Ferrari is interested. Corporate engineering often becomes isolated from real-world applications. This partnership would benefit us more than you realize." As they discussed details, Rogers reflected on the transformation that had reshaped not just his life, but the broader automotive industry. Major manufacturers now employed acoustic specialists trained in techniques Rogers had developed. University Engineering programs included coursework on empirical analysis methods. Even Thorne Dynamics under new management after Peregrine. Thorne's retirement following a series of patent disputes and corporate governance investigations had quietly adopted diagnostic approaches that resembled Rogers's methodology. Ripple effects extended beyond automotive engineering. Rogers had been invited to consult with aerospace companies, marine engine manufacturers, and industrial equipment specialists who recognized that his approach to mechanical diagnosis had applications far beyond car repair. But the most meaningful changes were visible in the neighborhood surrounding Eastside Automotive. Young people who might have left Detroit for opportunities elsewhere were now choosing to stay, inspired by proof that innovation could emerge from local expertise rather than requiring migration to corporate centers. The garage had become a symbol of economic development that honored community roots while embracing technological progress. As evening approached, and the day's activities wound down, Rogers found himself alone with Finch in the garage that had started everything. The original prototype engine still occupied its place of honor, but it was now surrounded by subsequent innovations modifications that addressed everything from motorcycle efficiency to industrial generator reliability. "Dad," Finch said, cleaning tools with the same methodical precision Rogers had learned from his own father. "Do you think we'll still be here in 20 years? Rogers considered the question that touched the heart of everything they'd built. Corporate partnerships and international recognition had brought opportunities to relocate, to establish research facilities in prestigious locations, to join the kind of institutional environments that typically housed automotive innovation. "Where else would we go?" Rogers replied. "This is where we learn to listen to engines. This is where your grandfather taught me that machines have voices. This is where you're learning that innovation doesn't require expensive equipment or advanced degrees, just patience, curiosity, and respect for the wisdom that emerges from experience." Finch nodded with the understanding that came from growing up in an environment where such principles weren't abstract concepts but daily realities. "Besides," he added with 13-year-old pragmatism, "Mrs. Rodriguez would never forgive us if we moved away." That evening, as Rogers documented the day's technical consultations and reviewed correspondence from engineers across the globe seeking advice on diagnostic challenges, he felt the satisfaction that came from work that had found its proper scale and purpose. The garage remained what it had always been, a place where broken things were made whole, where problems were solved through understanding rather than force, where the relationship between humans and machines was honored rather than exploited. But it had also become something larger, proof that innovation could emerge from anywhere, that wisdom often resided in unexpected places, and that listening carefully was often more valuable than speaking loudly. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the quietest voices. Rogers hadn't sought to revolutionize automotive engineering or challenge corporate orthodoxy. He'd simply wanted to fix engines well and provide a good life for his son. But in pursuing those modest goals with integrity and humility, he demonstrated principles that resonated far beyond the cramped confines of a neighborhood garage. What would happen if we all learned to listen a little more carefully to the voices that conventional wisdom often overlooks? The answer was visible every day at Eastside Automotive, where mechanics and engineers worked side by side, where young people learned that expertise could be earned rather than just credentialed, and where the patient work of understanding machines had created opportunities that changed lives, communities, and industries. The legacy wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. In a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and automation, Rogers Gus had proven that human intuition still mattered, that experience could triumph over credentials, and that sometimes the most important innovations emerged not from corporate laboratories but from small garages where people understood that machines had voices worth hearing and possessed the humility to listen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.